Hello everyone, welcome to Street Talk, brought to you by the Urban Violence Research Network. I'm Nick Pope and I'm an assistant editor with the network. I'm joined here today by Jenny Pearce, Professor Jenny Pearce, one of the important contemporary thinkers on violence and with a focus in Latin America. Jenny is currently a research professor at the Latin American and Caribbean Centre at the London School of Economics. Jenny works mainly with anthropological and participatory research methodologies on social change, violence, security, power, and participation in Latin America and beyond. Jenny's most recent book, Politics Without Violence, Towards a Post-Weberian Enlightenment, came out in 2020, and I'm sure will form the basis for some of the conversation today. So Jenny, welcome to Street Talk.
Thank you, very pleased to be with you.
So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, especially coming during an important moment for Latin America in terms of changing politics, the region's geopolitical role in the world, in terms of resource government, violence and security, indigenous rights, and a whole range of other important issues, which I hope we'll talk on some of those today. I guess I want to start by giving our listeners a glimpse into your world, really. And so your book came out in 2020, Politics Without Violence, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I was curious to understand what's been occupying you since then, since you published the book.
Right, well, the whole question of how we understand violence obviously is very much uppermost in my mind, especially working on Latin America, although that book isn't about Latin America. It's a conceptual book, but based on my history of working in areas of complex violences. And so I've been very interested since writing that book and before as well. I'm looking, for instance, at elites and violence. And this is because we tend to look at violence as it impacts on poor communities, poor urban communities particularly. But I'm very interested in why we don't ask the questions about what is the role of wealth and violence, not just poverty and violence or inequality and violence. So I've been working a lot, doing a lot of interviews with elites, and we brought out last year what we called a cartilla in Colombia, which was based on a database and also conceptual thinking on what is the nature of elite power in Colombia. We're now going into much more depth on that, but that's a particularly important piece of work. And the other area of work is taking up that theme of the conceptual book of 2020, which is towards a post-Weberian enlightenment, is we still use and have a reference the Weberian definition of the state as involving the monopoly of violence in a given territory, underpinned by legal rules and with legitimacy. And basically, my work on violence has led me to question whether that Weberian definition is still the most useful for us. And actually, in so many parts of the world, we have so much violence outside the state or in coordination with state actors. And I know your work in Rio on militias. And so these areas of violences outside the state but connected with the state, paramilitary violences in Latin America, and elsewhere in the world, are a subject of considerable interest for me.
That's great, thanks, Jenny. I guess I'm curious, really. I mean, you're talking about some big conceptual kind of questions there around around violence and its role in society in Latin America and beyond. But I'm kind of curious, what's been driving your interest in these areas that you've been working in? Why Latin America and why violence and conflict and peace?
Yes, well, this goes back to my PhD research, which was in Uruguay under the military dictatorship in 1975. And that experience of working in a period of time when a range of idealistic young people, it's the middle of the Cold War, obviously, had taken up various routes to change, some of which were violent, some weren't. But whatever the case, the military clamped down on that generation of young people, and not so young, but in a very brutal, savage way. So I lived that in Argentina, and I lived it in Buenos Aires, in Uruguay and Argentina. And so my first experiences were violence under military dictatorships, and Chile as well. I then later on spent time in Central America, where I lived a different kind of violence. I lived the violence of an insurgent war in a context of the Cold War, where the United States were backing what were understood to be a very small group of rich families in El Salvador, trying to prevent change the insurgent movement in El Salvador, which was represented in various groups, armed groups, but I went to live with the peasants in Chalatenango, El Salvador, to do an oral history of the peasant movement. And I went to understand what was their relationship with this armed struggle. Were they just doing the bidding of the armed actors, of the insurgent actors, or did they have a voice in this process? And I had the most incredible experience living with the peasants under constant bombing by planes supplied by the United States, in which I realized this was a process of participatory process of social change. The peasants were illiterate that I lived with, but they were the most ethical, knowledgeable people you could imagine. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they suffered incredibly from the violences that they lived and that were exercised by the Salvadoran army. So that experience was incredibly mind and life-changing, and led me to something which I think is a theme which is worth sort of academically recognizing, which is obviously I have a normative interest in social change. You know, having lived the violences of the Southern Cone and then of Central America, clearly I was very impacted by the actual suffering that violence generates. I recognized in El Salvador, for instance, that the peasants who I'd lived with gained very little from the peace. And then I began to look at sort of more deeply at, well, what is the role of our violence in bringing about change? If the peasants actually decided that they had no option, they used to say to me, war was done to us, we didn't choose war. And I really felt that when I lived with them. But they gained so little from the peace. And Salvador became one of the most violent countries in the world post the peace accord of 1992. So that raised a whole load of questions around what is the relationship between violence, social action, participation for change, and also the various violences that Salvador then became a place of violences that were called by some people no longer political, but social. So I began to ask the question, well, how do we distinguish between a political violence and a social violence? And I began in the 90s to work much more deeply in Colombia, a country where there was all kinds of violences in rural and urban areas. There was the insurgent violences, there was the state violences, there was the violences of criminality connected with drug trafficking. And so I worked a great deal in Medellin in Colombia and in other parts of Colombia, sort of lived some of the wars in places like Casanare in Colombia, where there was I looked at the relationship between oil and conflict and the violence. It was an area where British Petroleum, a British company, was accused of allying itself with paramilitary groups. So I looked at that whole relationship in depth. And constantly I've been asked sort of that normative questions are there. I think it's very important academically, if you do have normative questions and a normative commitment, that you actually are aware of how it impacts on your research. So I always probe my motivations. I don't want to actually see what I want to see. I take the research environment as something I have to research with objectivity, but at the end of the day, I have a subjective commitment to what we can call peace. And peace for me is the opposite of violence, not the opposite of conflict and not the opposite of war. Organized violence is obviously part of that, but conflict, I think, is inevitable in our world. Can't possibly imagine a world without conflict, but how do we address the violence that comes, degenerates into? So most recently, to finish, and sorry, it's a long answer to the question, I've been working in Mexico, and I've been working on a country that for a long time where you had a sort of centralized state under one political party, unlike Colombia, where there were two parties contesting. And I've been looking at how, as that single party lost that single party control of the state, violence has grown, drug trafficking has grown, all sorts of criminalities. And I've been looking at the various manifestations of Mexico and what are the challenges for peace in a country like Mexico.
That's fascinating, Jenny. I mean, you had a real kind of panorama of lived experience and academic kind of research, which has spanned a lot of different countries, and it's really incredible to hear that. I guess I wanted to understand a little bit more about the research that you're doing now and how this kind of fits into the contemporary moment across, in the region in Latin America. you know, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of maybe a kind of shift towards more left-leaning parties, in terms of, you know, Latin America's role on the global stage geopolitically. You know, how does your work kind of help us to understand some of these kind of shifts that are happening over at the moment?
I think one of the questions that interests me a great deal is, given that we often correlate violences with inequality, which I actually think there's a lot of evidence there is a great correlation. We have left governments now that I think have thought that inequality, you dealt with it to some extent. Lula decided, the Bolsa Familiar, to actually sort of address some of the kind of poverty, at least in some of the areas of Brazil, that this would reduce violences, right? And so, I mean, I shared that idea for a long time. But I began to realize that violence is actually has some logics. Violence is a phenomenon of it with its own distinctions. And therefore, if we are to address violences, we have to have a more complex understanding of violence and its role in our societies. And in that sense, I'm particularly interested in why left progressive governments actually don't seem to have policies for reducing violence and security policies that reduce violences that could actually make a real transformation possible. And here's the link with my work on participation. Because violence impedes participation. And so for me, the understanding that if we want to have a more participatory society, and I have to say that's one of my normative commitments, I believe in social agency for change. If we want that, we have to address the violences that impede it. So if left-wing governments wants to bring about change, they have to do more than reduce inequality. They have to make it possible for social agency to actually build a society that can address the conditions that lead to violence, including inequality, but they have to have the space to do it. And that space means that we have to address the violences that limit agency in all the spaces of socialization. So that has become a very important theme for me and remains very important as we have left-wing governments. I often say, well, it was actually a former student of mine, Jairo Bedoya, who always used to say, as Colombian, the left leaves security to the right. And I think if we are going to think of new approaches to security, we have to actually, progressive governments have to have their own policies towards security that are actually geared to reducing violences.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, what do you think is the kind of main impediment? What's impeding progressive left governments from doing that? You know, what's the barrier?
I think part of the problem is it's so normal on the left to think, as I said before, that violences are there because of inequality. The left in Latin America has obviously had an engagement with insurgent violences or armed struggle as a justifiable response to the structural violences, as Galtung and other people would call it. The idea of structural violence has had a huge important resonance in Latin America, partly because Bishop Helder Câmara in Brazil, who first talked about the violences that come from the structures that that actually mean if you are in a deeply unequal society, then there are people who suffer violence, if not directly, but indirectly through the poverty and discriminations that they live. So that notion that somehow or other that sort of armed struggle was justified against that structural violence has become very embedded in thinking. I think it's time now to rethink what we understand by violence, because violences are they have so many expressions. There are so many expressions to what we understand violence is. However, if we understand there is a phenomenon with its own distinctions that is violence, then I think it enables us to recognize that actually violence comes from a multiplicity of things that are happening to our bodies. I always talk about the biological body is actually a social body, and that now we can have conversations with natural scientists we could not have in the past. It was impossible for social scientists to talk to a biologist about violence in the past because biologists were understood to have a deterministic understanding. We're all by nature violent, therefore we can't do anything about it. So I don't accept that, right? And neither do a lot of the natural scientists today. What I have learned in interdisciplinary conversations with natural scientists is that, in fact, our bodies, our social bodies, are shaped by the social relationships we're born into, and that includes in the intimate space, and it includes the space of the home, it includes the space of the street, it includes the space of the school, the prison, and the very construction of the nation state itself. This is what leads to my sort of idea of chronic violences, because I'm looking at how violence is reproduced in multiple expressions through all and across all the spaces of socialization, not in a linear way at all. I don't quite agree with a continuum of violences. What I'm interested in is how we can research the multiple ways violences impact on our human agency and our sense of ourselves, by the traumas we experience through life, by the relationships we build with others, and why it is that aggression, which is natural to us, I think aggression is some part of the biological body. If we need to feel that we can defend ourselves if someone attacks us, but when does aggression become violence? And so for me, it's incredibly important for progressive people to begin to see violences in their multiple expressions, but to understand violence as a phenomenon that won't simply go away with addressing the conditions that generate violence. We need, in this age, in this world we're living in, to start to look at why violence, multiplies in so many spaces of socialization.
Maybe you can just give our listeners a bit of a background in terms of your discussion of Weber and the Weberian logic, and how you came to this this thought process, in about contemporary violence.
Yes. I mean, as a political scientist, which is how I started off, I now work as an anthropologist, I would say, and with participatory methods, but as a political scientist, I was trained in Weber. And so I was very much trained to look upon the state as in the terms that as he defined it. He's a brilliant sociologist and a thinker, and I have all my respect for Weber. But over time, this notion that the monopoly of violence by the state is essential part of the world order as it becomes gradually more liberal and democratic, I've become to question, because actually the notion of state monopoly of violence has been often used to justify violence by the state. It's almost as if the state monopolizes violence, the violence the state uses is not violence, right? It is because we have this legitimacy and legal rules. This means for Weber that the violence exercised by state actors is inevitable. He actually talked about the demonic genius of violence, and that politics and politicians will always have to address the issue of violence. And in fact, when he defined the state as the legitimate monopoly of violence over a given territory underpinned by legal rules, this was in a lecture he gave in 2019 on the politics as vocation. I was trying to get my book out actually to coincide 100 years with 2019. I got a year late, but anyway. But I think so for me, understanding violence is to then rethink what it is the state is doing when it uses violence. And this seems to me incredibly important if we are going to think, for instance, of a security policy that reduces violence, a security policy undertaken by the state. We have to understand that violence is not just political, in the sense that, yes, there's a lot of violence we could say is about taking on the state. And Weber was very worried, undoubtedly, because that's the times he was writing in. He was writing at a moment just after the First World War with that particular argument. And when Germany had become, obviously, a unified state under Bismarck, he was very influenced by that. And then the First World War shifted his perceptions. But it did mean that the issue of the violence that is trying to take control of the state as political violence is what mattered to him. What I suppose I'm trying to argue is that all violences matter, and that it's actually, you can't sort of only focus on that political violence, because actually these violences across the space of socialization, the violences in the intimate space, also matter, because that's where young children, experience often violences. First of all, they experience this often through child abuse, or they watch their mothers being beaten by their fathers. There's a range of violences that we now know so much about the long-term trauma that creates. So we know that one biologist, Susan Gerhardt, who tells us, for instance, that love makes the brain. And what her research as a biologist has shown is that the serotonin that we need to manage the aggression we might feel without that turning into violence actually grows. That serotonin grows with the first love the parents give to their child. So if you grow up in a situation where you're not receiving that love and you don't have that serotonin, I mean, it's not to say that that baby will grow on to become an assassin, nothing of the sort, but that child will have more propensity perhaps to take on violence as a route. And when adolescence happens, young men and adolescents, I think a statistic that continues to be, two statistics that continue to matter so much to our study of violences, which is that over 2/3 of homicides are created by young men, more or less 16 to 24, and then 24 to 44. Vast majority of violence is committed by young men of that age, homicides on young men, the young men of the same age of the victims and the perpetrators of that age. And then if you look at Latin America, a statistic that came out not long ago, a few years, 2017, was that there's a 1 in 50 chance of dying before you reach 31 if you're a poor young man in Latin America. So these issues of what is happening to young men from childhood and how they become males, this to me is a vital element for understanding, and very much so urban violences. You know, if we can't build, the problem I always say is not men. The problem is masculinities. The problem is the way men come to understand in societies that are deeply unequal why it is that violence then becomes something that gives them a sense of identity, belonging, and it becomes something that they feel they can use to become a man.
So, I mean, for researchers who are trying to understand this and trying to understand this, you know, broader definition that you're suggesting of violence, what can researchers do? What are some kind of practical steps that, you know, a researcher can do tomorrow to start to think in this way?
I do feel that opening the mind to the interdisciplinary conversations are very important. You know, we are in academia very siloed into our particular disciplinary fields, and Foucault was one of the first to sort of suggest that that was a sort of disciplinary way of making us think in certain blocks of thought. And I think when it comes to sort of researching violences, researching states, researching violences outside the state of various kinds, we really have to engage in conversations with across the disciplines. It's not easy. When I was writing this book, it was incredibly hard for me as a social scientist to get into psychology and neuroscience and all these fields. But it really helped me so much to come up with an understanding of violence that didn't mean I was kind of straitjacketed into thinking urban violence, social violence, political violence, domestic violence, all these different violences, and failed to see the violence as a phenomenon. And I came up with a working tool, which I do not consider to be a definition, but a working tool for debate, in which, and I learned this through that interdisciplinary conversation, that, for instance, from philosophers, particularly very philosophers, hermeneutics, where there's a real interest in the meaning, the way human beings generate meanings in their bodies. And so my working tool is that violence is meaning generating, meaning laden acts and actions of somatic harm on the body that potentially construct, destroy and or normalize social orders. So, I mean, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the very sort of significant thing for me, significant is the word, is this meaning generating and meaning laden way in which violence, because some people say, well, why do you have a suicide bomber? Why would someone want to kill themselves? But that gives meaning to somebody in their life. I die, but I bring others with me. And that's the meaning I've lived. And then when I work in Mexico with drug traffickers, I mean, I'm not with drug traffickers, but I work on the question of drug trafficking and the criminalities and the young people that get drawn into this and what it means for politics, which is what I'm particularly interested in. You can't help but be aware of how drug traffickers have used violence in a spectacular way, a performative way of messaging with hanging bodies up, you know, across streets. This is what will happen to you if you betray us. And the sort of the way in which violence has becomes increasingly savage in some contexts. This savagery is because the messaging has to be even tougher and nastier in order for the people you want to convince to obey you or to work with you or to accept you. You know, the messages have to be very, very powerful indeed.
And so, Jenny, I mean, you kind of mentioned about the importance of social orders in terms of your thinking about violence. And I guess I was curious to tap into a little bit. I mean, thinking about the network here in terms of urban violence, you know, about the urban dimensions in terms of, you know, how we think about these orders and actually, you know, what nature, I mean, how does the urban kind of change your thinking around this? I mean, is there a certain dimension that we have to think about for to kind of stretch this idea of violence, or what is the role of the urban in your thinking here?
I think this issue of spaces of socialization is very important for me, and taking us to the urban as spaces of socialization where obviously, you know, people come closer and closer together. And you asked me at one point about why I got involved in Latin America, and I actually also work in the UK, by the way, and I've worked in urban areas in particularly when I was in peace studies in Bradford. I worked a lot on issues in Bradford in the city and about the riot that took place in 2001 and also the fact that young guys were getting very into the drugs trade. So, but what I was looking at was, you know, again, the experience of the socialization that takes place in particular urban areas and what that means for the reproduction of violences. And I suppose in Latin America, what you can't ignore, it's the most urbanized region of the world, of the global south, sorry. And secondly, the urbanization in Colombia, which is a country I've worked on a great deal, in 3 decades, Colombia went from a mostly rural country to an 80% urban country. So that accelerated urbanization that takes place in the global south and particularly Latin America, I think gives us insights into particular ways in which violence can be reproduced through spaces of socialization. And particularly you have to, again, the interdisciplinary questions are, of course, how that urbanization connects to the failure of economic processes to generate dignified ways of life in those urban areas for young people. And I noticed, for instance, when I started working in Medellin, I remember decades ago, this was in the kind of early 90s when Medellin had a homicide rate of over 390 per 100,000 people. I mean, absolutely astronomical, incredible. The young men, the ratio between young men and young girls was shifting 1 to 5 in favor of the young girls because all the young men were killing each other. And so immediately the question is, well, what is happening? Obviously, Colombia is known for its rural violence as well, because the insurgent groups and the criminal groups that are actually taking on the sort of drug trafficking corridors, many of them are deeply involved in rural areas. But however, the urban areas are where a lot of the violence expresses itself most intensely. And I lived the process in Medellin, for instance, where narcomenudeo or local, that wasn't the case when I started working in Medellin, but you'd have gangs selling drugs locally. The drugs, when I first worked in Medellin and Colombia, all were exported, right? And then narcomenudeo, the selling drugs locally, shifts very much the relationships, because now local gangs are actually making money for themselves and selling them to kids, getting kids involved in the drugs trade, and this changes the nature of the city a lot, and extends the kind of use of violence. And when I go up, a few years back, when I went up to one of the comunas in Medellin, because that level of violence, of homicides, began to change, as well, is well known in the 2000s, and Medellin wanted to be the city, the urban area that had most dealt with its homicides, its violences. So that level of violence sort of fell to something like 28 per 100,000. But when I went up to talk to people in the comunas, the poor areas where the gangs, or the combos as they're called, are present, I found that now, they said to me, if you want, you have to ask permission of the combo if you're going to kill. They wanted to control the homicide rates, and they continued to sell the virginity of young girls and to extort. And so another issue for me around violence in urban areas is the continuous mutations that I have lived. Going back to Medellin and other cities in Latin America, I have, been to Rio and Sao Paulo, and obviously I work a lot now in cities in Mexico, and understanding that these violences and then criminalities mutate, and that actually the gangs, it could become too costly to murder. So for me, the murder rate is not a great sort of measure of, it's useful comparative measure, but I'm much more interested in the mutations and the different expressions of violence, and that, to understand how that impacts a community, you have to then understand the way in an urban area violences will sort of mutate and reproduce across so many of the spaces of socialization. Those intimate spaces become very important in urban areas. Understanding, so some people talk about domestic violence, right? I prefer to talk about the violences in the intimate space, because, to actually give it the same weight as the violences of the criminal violences, and the same weight as all violences matter. That's probably the big message that I get. And the urban actually enables us to see that, I think, very clearly, because you have people, living closely together. You have communities where the violences and the criminalities reproduce more, sometimes more than other areas. You have to understand that. And all those logics give us, as researchers, a lot of questions that we have to engage in. But I, for me, not just looking at the homicide rate, but that's where my understanding of violence as potentially normalizing a social order, destroying a social order, or constructing a social order becomes very important, which is why the concept of criminal governance I have a certain sort of question about, because I feel the word governance doesn't capture the violences in all the space of socialization that underpin the orders where criminal actors have a great deal of capacity to control those social orders. They actually control those social orders with a lot of violences embedded in the way they do that control. Sometimes it's not as apparent as it is in other areas, but sometimes, and I know this, I'm sure you know this, the local criminal actor will punish a husband who rapes his wife or hits his wife. That has happened. I know that happens in Medellin, but that doesn't mean to say they're against violence in the intimate sphere.
It's fascinating. I mean, I think you touched on a point there about your work in the north of England. I was just kind of curious to understand a bit more how that fed into this, your thinking, and obviously there's, big differences between, let's say, the global north and the global south in broad terms, but there's also, I mean, I'm curious about the kind of similarities and what kind of links up the work that you've done in the north of England.
Well, it helped me greatly to understand the issue of policing in these contexts, because I actually took the police of Bradford to Medellin. We did an exchange for 4 years, funded by the British Council. And I did that in order to, first of all, to help I mean, obviously Bradford police don't need my help, but to encourage them to ask the question, if you don't intervene in time as young men get into drug trafficking, this is what will happen. and Medellin is an example of those mutations, how young men get into more and more levels of criminality and violence. And so to understand the violences of Medellin and the link with criminalities, and much more exaggerated, very different histories, obviously, to Bradford, although Bradford and Medellin are quite interesting. They both had textile industries that collapsed. And I think, you know, you can trace something of the rise of drug trafficking and Escobar in Medellin to the search for dignified labor. And in Bradford, I don't want to exaggerate it because it's nothing like the extent of what, and I'm talking about that period of the 1990s and 2000s. You certainly I found many frustrated young guys, you know, who kind of came, and many of them for Asian families that had come over to work in the textile factories. Not all of them, you know, a lot of white guys also in the drug trade, but, you know, definitely there was some sort of correlation there. So I felt there was sort of something of interest here. And I thought the Medellin police could learn something about policing from the Bradford police, because the Bradford police, you know, don't go around with guns and the Medellin police do. However, I would just want to sort of say this because we learned such a lot from that exchange. Because one of the issues was that the Bradford police had actually, and I did a lot of work because I did sort of worked on the history of the riot and the process which led to the 2001 riot in Bradford. And I found that the policing had been, they treated the young Asian guys as all being problematic once they started sort of taking drugs. It was problematic with the Asian young guys' families as well, because drugs was not, you know, in Islam, drugs and alcohol not good. And so, but the way the racism that the Asian guys were being treated with made them feel they were nothing, right? They were lowest of the low. And so to get the sort of, to understand how that sense of I'm worthless, you know, but gosh, you know, get into the drug trade, I can become somebody. You know, this for me was incredibly important to understand really sort of deeply. And then what was very interesting in Colombia, in Medellin, when we were there with the Bradford police, was there's a new approach to policing. And they had begun to think at the beginning of the 2000s in community policing. And they recruited the police in the community police on the different basis to all the recruitment had taken place in the past. They recruited them for not having tortured during the early 90s under the Escobar period. So violence enters in, right? How and I found police in the community police of Medellin at that time who were poets, who wrote. There were more women in the police, right? But then we learned that the mainstream police, so to speak, not the community police, began to see that police force as the feminine of the police, because they weren't hard men like the previous police and like they were. And so they would often take away the community police badges, right, and go into the community pretending to be community police, because the people in the community had gained trust with that community police because they treated them with respect. They took their badges and then they did intelligence work. And in the end, that process of community policing got undermined. And so there was a whole learning process about how to treat people, how to work with people, you know, I mean, we have now in this country a big problem with our metropolitan police and issues of sexism and racism. And so, you know, there's lots to be learned in the global north as well as the global south. But in the global south and in Colombia, these are issues, again, it links to that notion of how we can get security from the left, how we can get a security that reduces violence. And you have to have policing that actually respects people and that recognizes that there's been a long process of intergenerational transmissions of violences that have led young men, and a system in which no dignified labor is available. To be someone in this world, you know, criminality is often the only route, and in the urban sort of environment, that becomes, you know, something where you can form gangs, you can form groups where you feel you belong, you're respected, you have status. Yes, you'll die young, but you've died and you've lived a life where you could afford a few things, leaving a few kids on the planet. And but dying young means you've no horizon. And I think the sort of urban violences of Latin America mean that we have a hell of a lot of young kids who've no horizon other than to die young, but to die having been part of criminality.
I guess with those reflections, Jenny, I mean, I'm just thinking about, maybe more looking at the kind of policy space here, and this is maybe opening a Pandora's box, but maybe just as a kind of final question, what can this kind of look like? I mean, you've kind of alluded to, or kind of given some indications of what the characteristics of this type of new way of thinking might be. But I wonder if you have any kind of examples of things that might maybe have been kind of tried and tested and succeeded in the past, or any kind of suggestions that kind of people can think about in terms of policies or programming that has worked, and just to give a bit more kind of make it a bit more tangible in terms of the actions that we can think about.
Well, first of all, the Bradford experience was very important for this because we worked a lot. We built a program for a peaceful city in Bradford, and we worked a lot with the police. And from that, because a lot of the rioters were imprisoned for 4 years for riot, and then and that was because there was a provocation by a right-wing group in Bradford. And then in 2011, another group, the English Defence League, came to also provoke a riot. But we'd worked a lot between academics, police, the local politicians, the local civil servants, the youth service, and we'd come to understand each other. And the police had begun to form relationships in the community with the young guys in a way, rather than just think, oh, here are criminals, right? They began to get to know them, right? And the youth service helped a great deal on that. And when the English Defence League came, what was fascinating was that even ex-rioters persuaded their nephews, their sons sometimes, not to be provoked. And Bradford did not have a riot and in that moment. And so there was Bradford learned a tremendous amount in that period. And then when I look at Latin America, I'm very interested in how my research can contribute to action and to understanding. And that's what the participatory research methods part of my work is. I don't do only participatory methods, but I'm very interested in non-extractive research that goes back to people, so that what we learn can actually enable people to think through where should their agency go to reduce violences and to engage on the issues of criminality. And so we worked a lot with Alexandra Abello, my colleague at LSE. We worked on agendas for human security in 4 urban areas of Mexico. And the idea of human security is to sort of try and broaden the understanding of what security is about, not to avoid the issue of violence and those issues, they're very important, but to understand that most people in urban areas are suffering a range of insecurities. They're housing insecurities, there's no public spaces, environmental insecurities, health insecurities. And so that idea that came out of the UN, which some people see as just too broad to deal with the problem, we found, and we already found it in Medellin, where there's an observatory of human security that we worked with, that they actually, people, when they hear the word human security, they say, that's the security we want, because there's something that recognizes the multiple terrains of insecurity. And also humanizing security, the idea is you can't offer security which reproduces more violence. And that relates to the state. And if the state uses violence indiscriminately, rather than actually recognizes those levels of insecurity people live and what's happening to young men particularly, then you'll just reproduce the problem. And so in Mexico, and I'm still working in Apatzingán in Mexico, and with Trevor Stackett at the University of Aberdeen, we're working in Guadalajara and Zamora and Jalapa, and we're working on how I like to work with communities on participatory methods to sort of co-construct agendas of human security, where they put forward proposals, because often people living in violent communities in urban areas are looked upon as all part of the problem. Well, but the participatory methods, when you spend time with them, show that people are actually able to put forward proposals. And we develop proposals to the state, to their own community, and to other civil society actors. And now Trevor works much more on sort of civil society groups, and we've been looking at how we can persuade states, officers and politicians to collaborate with actors in civil society and communities on reducing violences. And so I mean, I can't tell you success stories in the sense that we've managed to reduce violences overnight, because that's never going to happen. I think it's about beginning a new debate, what I call resetting the conversation, trying to sort of rethink how we understand the violence, how we understand the importance of that intimate space, as well as the street space, as well as the spaces in which we see homicides and in the street or in prisons, etc. Once we understand that all those violences matter, and we need policies which are actually going to connect different actors together to address violences in all the spaces, until we begin to see that as vital and change our understanding of what security is all about, we're not going to address the problem over the long term. So, there will be short-term, medium-term, longer-term goals. And it's difficult at the moment to say, well, there's a massive success story. Some people think Medellin was a great success story. They reduced homicides, but for me, they didn't reduce all the violences, and they didn't reduce the extortion that goes on, or the drug trafficking and criminalities. Obviously, it's very good that homicides were reduced, but we need a broader understanding, and in order to unleash that participation and agency for social change that can work on the conditions that reproduce violence.
Wow, Jenny, there's certainly a lot of food for thought here, so thank you so much, and I think others will agree. This has really kind of stimulated the mind in many ways, and I think just you've done really well to kind of connect the big conceptual theory discussions in this conversation today with the kind of practical thinking for practitioners and policymakers and people kind of working on this side of research. So thank you very much for your time. We could go on for hours, but I think unfortunately we cannot today. But thank you for your time and all your inspirational work. Yeah, thank you very much to everyone for watching as well. Can I all encourage you to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel for more of these videos. We have other videos available and other episodes online as well. There'll be a link to those videos in our show notes below. And we also have a Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages as well. So if you want to kind of follow our work, our blog posts, and our videos, then please do. And just to say thank you once again more to Jenny for the time today, and we'll see everyone again for the next episode very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.